In this video, we're going to talk about the relational model integrity constraints. There are three integrity constraints. The first one is the entity integrity constraint, which states that a primary key attribute cannot be null, which means that it cannot be blank. It must have data. So of the two relations that are represented here, which of these violates the entity integrity constraint? The one on the right violates the entity integrity constraint because the salesperson ID is the primary key and therefore it cannot be null. The one on the left is okay because the territory ID could be a foreign key that could be blank. Foreign keys can be blank if it has an optional one on the parent side of the relationship. The next type of integrity constraint is referential integrity, which states that the foreign key value must match a primary key value in the relation of the one side. So basically, if I have a foreign key, that value must exist as a value in the table where the primary key resides. So for example, if I have a 5 for customer ID in the order table, there must be a customer ID in the customer table with the number 5. The same would go for order ID, and product ID must exist in the order table and product table if they're going to be provided as a value in the order line table. The third type of integrity constraint is the domain constraint, which is a list of all allowable values for an attribute. So for example, in the customer table, we have attributes customer ID, name, and state, and this defines the possible values. The domain constraint is the right column here, which states that the customer ID is going to be an integer, which means numbers without decimals, with the maximum size of 11 numbers. The name is going to be variable characters, so varchar, with the size of 255 characters. The state is going to be a character of size 2, which means that we're going to just use the state abbreviation. The order date is going to use date time, which is going to have the format of the year, month, day first, and then hours, minutes, seconds. The quantity is also going to be an integer, just like customer ID, and price is going to be a double, which is an integer that has decimals. So a double of size 10(2) is going to have 8 numbers on the left and 2 decimals on the right. So with regarding the relational model that we had on the previous slides, we now have defined all the domain constraints that exist for each one of the attributes in our relational model. So now what I want you to do is address the integrity constraints that we previously discussed in the relational model down below. So I want you to identify the attributes that would enforce the entity integrity constraints. I want you to identify the referential integrity constraints that must exist. And finally, identify the domain constraints for each attribute of each relation. So pause this video, try this on your own, and then come back to compare your answers. All right, welcome back. So the first step, identify the attributes that would enforce entity integrity constraints. These are going to be the primary keys. So I'm going to underline the department ID, and I'm going to underline the employee ID and the employee ID together with course ID and certificate, and the course ID and course. The next thing it asks us to identify the referential integrity constraints that might exist. So let's go ahead and draw from department ID to department ID, indicating that the department ID in the employee table must match a value that exists as a value in the department ID on the department table. Same goes for employee ID and certificate, referencing employee ID and employee, and course ID and certificate, referencing course ID and course. All right, the third part is to identify the domain constraints. So we're going to identify department ID as an integer. Name, we will say, is varchar. Employee ID is also an integer. However, you may argue it could be varchar if the employee ID has letters in it, and that may be correct. Same goes for the department. First name is going to be varchar. Last name is going to be varchar. Salary, it may have decimals, so it's not going to be an integer. Instead, it's going to be a double. Since we've already identified department ID as an integer in the department table, it must be the same in the employee table. So we'll identify this as integer. Then we'll go to course. We'll say course is integer. Title we'll say is varchar. Description might have more than 255 characters, which is the limit on varchar, so we'll go ahead and actually use a different domain constraint called text. On certificate, we'll use integer for employee ID, and we'll use integer for course ID. And then for completed, we'll use when they completed as the date time.